Hi there. Welcome to Better Conversations Live. Your host today, I'm myself and Ben. Today's guest is going to be Drew Tarvin. And just pop this up for you folks. Do drop your comments, any questions in the chat, or if you're watching this watching the replay, then do drop your questions and comments in the discussions below. I mentioned Drew is our guest today, and Ben, you're going to be talking to him, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, looking forward to speaking with Drew. So Drew spoke at our conference last year, Better Conversations for Leaders. So I enjoyed his talk. So looking forward to getting back to having a chat with him.
Yeah. Yeah. And so a bit of housekeeping then, I guess. We are on every Tuesday, right?
Yeah, every Tuesday live, 1 p.m. UK time. Get involved, follow us, add some questions in the chat, or get involved on YouTube for replays. Anybody else that's catching up afterwards.
Yeah. And those are the times if you're in different time zones. Yeah. And as Ben said, follow us to know when we're live. But also, if you want to be a guest on Better Conversations, you can either message any of the hosts directly or drop an email to bclive@betterconversations.co. And so you can follow Ben on LinkedIn here, and you can follow myself on LinkedIn here. Before we came on live, Ben, I shared with you my interest in the kinds of conversations that maybe con artists and fraudsters, basically anyone, deceives, lies. I'm really fascinated and curious about those kinds of conversations because it does happen at work, not maybe on a grand scale day to day, but there is plenty of case studies, right, of corporate fraud and so on. So it definitely happens. What do you think those conversations are like?
Well, I think there's quite a lot of grey areas as well. Between being persuasive and influencing, trying to sell things, versus being an out and out con artist or fraudster. I think there's quite a few grey, blurry lines. And I think we probably focus on individuals because we can resonate with them, we can see them. But this is happening across all forms of advertising. We're kind of bombarded with advertising, which is doing the same thing, trying to persuade us to buy things which perhaps we don't need. So that's something which is a little bit different compared to perhaps the less intrusive advertising years of when things were a bit black and white.
Yeah, definitely. There is that piece. I'm just posting here the article that I read recently that I shared with you about, our fascination with con artists and fraudsters. And there's been plenty a movie made about people who've become legends, I guess, in society, right? And I just find that fascinating. Whether people find themselves kind of falling into it and going, oh, actually, this is easy, and people are believing me, they're believing what I'm saying, or whether they actually set out to deceive. And therefore, I'm really curious about the kind of conversations that must happen in their own minds about how they're going to go about trying to deceive someone. What do you think? Do you think it's people are more strategic, or some people fall into it just because it seems to work, so they carry on doing it?
Yeah, I don't think there's one size fits all. I think that maybe people experiment, maybe people idolize con artists in films and movies, and perhaps perhaps the kind of legends which media, elevates, so they kind of capture our imagination. Who knows? Who knows? I think that some might depend on your childhood and how you were brought up. Some might depend on how your brain works, and how your thoughts and your emotions connect or don't connect. It's probably really complex. I don't think there's one clean answer, unfortunately.
I did read somewhere that your brain, once you start, the first lie you tell kind of registers more on our moral compass and our hormones. But the more lies we tell, the more we condition our brain to being okay with it, which is potentially why some people don't even figure on, and they do lie detection tests. They're looking for a change in physiology that shows some discomfort. But if you've been great at you've got used to, you've acclimatized your brain to tell fibs, then that might be interesting too. Mag's just popped in there. Are these defined by not having the other person at the center of the conversation? Yes, probably. I'd say so. What do you think, Ben?
I guess so. I think, I just think that. Well, I was just, to be honest, I was just starting to think about the brain, and that's where my brain had gone to, and I was starting to think that the kind of lie detector piece, and that kind of, I don't know, just made me think about how part of our brain is like the interpreter. So it basically weaves together stories of what it interprets in the world, and so we start weaving these stories about things which aren't real, but we feel, and we think they're actually real. So I was just starting to think about that, and then how we almost become more clever. We actually then weave more complex stories to make them sound even more justifiable, even more real. And so it's super complex. But
fascinating.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Well, you look. I guess a message out to our audience: if you are a former con artist or a fraudster, I think it would be cool to get someone on to just understand a little bit more how they got down that road. And I'd be fascinated about the kind of conversations they were having. So if you know someone or you are that person, you can get in touch, and I'll just pop up the email again for getting in touch with us if you wanted to come on and be our guest, because I think it is fascinating. There's also sort of research that says sometimes we want to believe what we're told, even though we probably think it's not quite true. So I kind of find that fascinating. Glenn's jumped on. He said, does a con artist have to be a person? What about a platform or software or social media platform that influences voting or the mood of its users? Ben, you've got quite a bit to say on that, I think.
Yeah, well, we would mention this earlier on, that we focus on individuals, but actually probably more pervasive is algorithms. So we've got algorithms that can beat a grand master at chess, and we've got these algorithms basically persuading individuals what they should and shouldn't do, what they should believe, what they should vote for, what they should buy, and that's because that's everywhere. I think we should perhaps be a little bit more concerned about that, because it's less visible, and that's more under the radar. But it shapes anything and everything. So I think fair point, Glenn.
Yeah, well, I think we're pigeonholed and sent down different tunnels, right? For that. Cool. Well, before we get into the humour side of it, so this is going to be an interesting discussion. Before we get into that, I do just want to do a quick share, if I may, which is something that we're going to be trying, which is this Live Leadership Pro. These are going to be live calls on Zoom every Wednesday at 8 a.m. UK time. And the purpose of them is to jump on if you've got a challenge that's going on currently for you in the workplace, a relationship, a conflict, thinking about your career growth, your planning, some of those trickier conversations, trying to influence people, trying to be a good colleague. Any of those issues, Mag and I are going to be addressing those on Wednesdays at 8 a.m. There's information on the website, BetterConversations.co, and you can't miss Leadership Live Pro is kind of splashed all over. So you can sign up. They're going to be Zoom meetings. And so if you've started your week and it's going a little bit pear-shaped, register, tell us. You can then email us with the challenge that you're facing at the moment. And then 8 a.m. Wednesdays. That's going to be starting next week, the 19th. We are going to be answering those questions, doing a bit of spot coaching, definitely have you walk away with some things to try out and tips that you can actually put into practice. So that's that coming up. Now, Ben, we have a slight hitch here. I think you know what I'm going to say. So we're really looking forward to Drew joining us. He is East Coast US. It is on the early side, and we're trying to reach him, but so far our act has not arrived. So it's you and me, Ben. I'm going to be talking about humour, and so I'm actually going to flip the table. I'm going to ask you some questions about humour, neurodiversity, and what your position on it is. And you know, if Drew grabs his coffee and manages to join us, then fantastic. Otherwise, we will reschedule. We'll have another chat with him for sure. Yeah. So perhaps just a little bit of a background, Ben, if you could give us on our absent guest, and that as a way of introducing the topic and what your fascination is.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm not a comedian, and I'm not an improv artist, but I suppose we have to probably do a bit of improv today, don't we? So try and practice the theme. But yeah, so Drew was actually a humour engineer, which is the world's first self-declared one of its kind. And yeah, he's kind of many things really. He's a speaker, author, comedian, and runs Humour That Works. And so I was just really interested in the role that humour plays really in so many different domains in the workplace, and so I just wanted to really explore with Drew, how do leaders and why should they use it first of all, but actually how do you then go about using humour in ways which actually makes teams function, makes teams more productive, and there's a huge element of reducing stress as well. And given the last 12 months, I think that's incredibly important. So there's quite a few things.
No, definitely. And Drew has got an enormous amount of information. I will share his website details, because definitely worth visiting. He is well researched and guides a great deal on the use of humour. I thought his talks were kind of really fascinating, just to understand differences between genders, differences of authority, and so on. So I think one of your questions. Why don't you share maybe your personal story, Ben? In regard to the part that maybe humour or comedies has, where it's been, or where the challenges have been.
Yeah, well, I think that it's only really when I perhaps got into my 30s that I looked back and understood with reflection about the role that humour played with me growing up. I had a relatively unsettling childhood, and being outdoors, having fun, was maybe kind of a couple of my coping mechanisms. And I think that humour just got me out of quite a few scrapes as a youngster, as a teenager growing up, that perhaps I could laugh or kind of playfully get out of things which perhaps would ordinarily have got me in trouble. And then, so looking back, I kind of realised that maybe just being a jester, maybe being a bit of a clown, was kind of my way of coping with stress and with difficult situations. And so in that sense, that humour for me was just an outlet, a valve for kind of releasing that pressure. And so then kind of looking then back on the workplace, where I ended up being in places where it was really serious, and I didn't have leaders who could share a joke, could see fun of difficult see fun in or see things which were amusing in difficult situations. That's where I really struggled. And just looking back on everything really in my life, all the stories which I have with my friends, they're all anchored by just having lots of fun. And so I think just humour was just incredibly important for lots of different ways for me. What about you?
Well, I'll come to me in a moment.
Yeah, okay.
But I just wanted to pull in a comment because it resonated with what you were saying, which was Mag was saying, first thing that jumps to mind is humour as a defence mechanism and also as a social glue when trust is present. And I think that kind of echoes what you were saying. And it definitely, a good friend of mine used it growing up as a way of diffusing tense moments in an environment where he didn't feel particularly part of the culture, so especially in a bullying environment, to be able to make your adversaries laugh is very disarming. And so I think that's a skill that we can learn at quite a young age. For me, humour is, I've always thought I think in humorous terms, and I think about situations, I think also from a young age, just thinking about things and almost sort of imagining little skits in my mind about, that would be funny, and that would be a funny scenario. But I think it's only as I've gotten older that I've got more comfortable with it, and that might be just my own self-confidence growing. And also I think it depends on the people that you're with, right? The people that you're hanging out with, you either feel comfortable, you can show your full personality, and certainly when I'm in conversations with clients, finding moments of humor, irony, being able to laugh, being ready to laugh is important, but there's also a sensitivity. It's not always appropriate to laugh. And I have some awesome news, which is to say that Drew is here. I'm going to bring him in.
Yeah, cool.
Hello.
Hello. How you doing, Drew?
I am doing well. Guess who slept through an alarm this morning?
Couldn't possibly imagine.
That is this one. Yeah. So I am here in Panama, and we are a little bit earlier than you all. And I don't know if I didn't set an alarm, if I slept through it, but I woke up and I was like, oh, I'm excited for this conversation we're about to have. And I was like, oh, this conversation that is happening right now in this moment. So, what I heard you all talking about, it sounded like, yes, I agree with those things around humor.
Yeah, perfect.
Excellent.
Well, I think we just done a personal introduction, so actually it was ideal. So, yeah. Awesome.
I am going to bow out and leave you to it.
Cool. Thanks, Sehaam. Yeah, good stuff, Drew. Well, I did an introduction to your work, and we've pointed people in the direction of your treasure trove, which is your website. So there's lots of activities for people there. But yeah, so I just talked a little bit about my personal story about how important humour was for me growing up. But Yeah, I guess humor's just part of our culture in general and our DNA. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts really on why workplaces are so serious and why our classrooms are so unplayful when actually that's it's a fundamental part of who we are. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean it's a great question, and so thank you to Ben and to Sehaam for hosting as part of this conversation, for setting the stage, and for all of you kind of listening in. And to answer the question of why is the work so serious so far, it's an interesting question that I had at the beginning of this, because when you look at all of the benefits of using humor in the workplace, it helps both you as an individual and as an organization. So it's like, okay, why don't we do this more? So I did a study. We ran a study with over 1,000 people a few years ago. And the number one reason why people didn't use humor in their workplace was that they didn't think that their boss or coworkers would approve, which is interesting. There's a couple of implications because of that. I think part of that is, one, if you go into a culture that doesn't have humor, then I think you're kind of thinking like, oh, well, maybe it's not welcome here. And the reality is that, 98% of CEOs prefer job candidates with a sense of humor, according to a study of over 700 CEOs. And in a different study of more than 2,000 employees in Australia, they found that 81% of employees said a fun workplace would make them more productive. So people want it. They're open to it. It's just that they just don't know if they can do it. And it's the implication of that is interesting, though, because it means that if you are a leader of an organization and you aren't seeing people laugh, and if you aren't seeing people smile and use humor, then it means that you're probably part of the reason why. Not maliciously, not intentionally, but something about the way that you're behaving, or something about the way that you are treating things is leading to people not feeling like they can be their full authentic self at work, which humor is certainly a component to it. So I think the biggest aspect of all of it, though, is just this cultural. I remember speaking at an event early on when I was starting to do this, and an older gentleman came up to me afterwards, and he was like, listen, I see what you're saying, but I grew up learning that work is supposed to feel like work. And that if work was supposed to be fun, then it would be called play. And so it's almost this mentality of like, no, if you're having fun at work, then maybe you're not taking it seriously, or maybe you're not doing it as well. And so I think it's just this disconnect to realize that humor doesn't mean that you can't be serious about what you're doing. And in fact, if you are serious about your work, or if your work is important, then humor becomes a really important part of how you do it.
And just to be clear, what you do with your work through Humour That Works, it's not teaching people how to be funny, is it? It's actually helping leaders to be effective, and I think that's the crucial thing, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. This is not teaching you how to become a stand-up comedian, although you will learn techniques from it. It's rather to see humor as another tool in your tool belt that you can use at specific times to intentionally get better results, because it works, because it's effective with people. Yeah,
absolutely. And so you kind of touched on it before about this culture, which is, or these kind of ideas about work, which have been passed down through generations, that actually work was just meant to be drudgery, and you just got on with it. And we kind of give careers advice to young people with the same mentality, the same ideas, that actually, work is still, pretty rubbish. Just get on with it. And I think that lacks a bit of imagination, to say the least. I just wonder actually whether we've confused people with machines or robots. Have you got any kind of thoughts on how we differ? What's your take on that?
Well, absolutely, and I think that's a big part of it. And it's only gotten, I think, in some ways, gotten worse during the pandemic, because with so much virtual happening, our coworkers almost feel more and more like Alexa or Siri, or a smart device, a Google Home or whatever, because you say this command out loud to technology and then you get a response back. And so it becomes very easy to kind of like mistake or forget that the person on the other side of a virtual meeting or the other side of an email or the other side of a phone call is a fellow human being with a life and emotions. And maybe, like just maybe, the reason that that email is late to you isn't because they secretly hate you, but because they have a sick kid at home, or because they're going through the stress of something else. And humor helps to remind us of that humanity. And I think you're absolutely right. It starts with kind of the way that we talk about, where it's like, just put your head down and work. Like we hear that in terms of a thing. So like, oh, you just have to work really, really hard. And I learned, I realized this once I was at Procter & Gamble, was that growing up, I had learned the skills I needed to do a job. No one had ever taught me how to enjoy a job. We never talked about that aspect of like, hey, it's important to be able to do these skill sets, but it's also important to have a little bit of fun, a little bit of joy. And I think there's two reasons why we should have that work. The two things that like reason why it's valuable to do that. One is that it's just something that we do a ton of. The average person will work 90,000 hours in their lifetime. 90,000. That is longer than everything that is on Netflix. That is a tremendous amount of our time for us to just say, you know what, you just have to kind of muscle through it. You just have to kind of be strong about it and then move and just put your head down, enjoy the other stuff. That's what most people are like. It's like, you work hard here, you're not going to like it, but you do it so that you have money or resources or whatever to do this other stuff. It's like, that's so much time of our life to not be enjoying. And then here's the best part about humor, though. When used effectively, it helps you do your job better, right? So it's not just, hey, do it because it's fun, but do it because it's going to help you to improve your communication skills. It's going to help you to relieve some of that stress. It's going to help you think more creatively. It's going to help you to influence people a little bit. Like there's all these benefits to using humor. So it's this double benefit of not only do you like your work a little bit more, you actually do it better.
Yeah. And, why wouldn't you? I think is why wouldn't you? So I think we're talking a little bit out of sync because we started a few minutes late and we didn't touch on your personal journey. So perhaps before we get into how leaders can start dabbling with introducing humor into the workplace and understanding actually what makes good humor, thinking about context, thinking about banana skins as well. But what was your kind of experience of going through the corporate world, and how did you end up doing what you do, and what was your story, just as a quick snapshot?
Yeah, as a quick snapshot. So I started my full career at Procter & Gamble as an IT project manager, and I remember being in this meeting at P&G that was incredibly boring. It was one of those like meetings so boring that it makes you want to cry levels of boring, like where you just start like daydreaming about other things you wish you could be doing instead of being in that meeting. You're like, I wish I could like fold laundry right now, or like maybe I should schedule a root canal so I feel something again. And Ben, I don't know if you've ever been in a meeting like that that's so boring. The problem with this particular meeting was that I was the one leading the meeting. And I had this realization where I was like, okay, if I'm bored while talking, the audience has to be bored while listening. And I had a bit of this existential crisis because it was relatively early in my career. And I was like, oh no, is this the rest of my career? Is this the next 50 years of my life, is going from boring meeting to countless emails back to boring meetings? And so I was talking with a friend of mine about it, and he was like, listen, Drew, you like to solve problems. It's like, which is true. I love solving problems. I do, Sudoku for fun, for Ken. I don't think of them as math problems. I think of them as math opportunities. So I love solving problems. And he was like, why not solve the problem of boredom? And I hadn't really thought of it in those way, but I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. So I started to bring in things that I thought would make things a little bit more fun. And this particular friend was also the one who had introduced me to humor, because at university, I went to The Ohio State University, got a degree in computer science and engineering, but while there, also started doing improv and stand-up, because this friend of mine kind of forced me to do it. And I started to bring in what I had learned in improv and stand-up, and realized I was getting better results. Like people were starting to come, as I started to do it, people would come to my meetings, were more likely to come, or they're more likely to respond to my emails when I add a little bit of humor to them, or I get engaged in my own work a little bit more. So that kind of snowballed into this effect where I did it for myself for a while, started to notice the results, started to look at the research for it, and realized like, no, there's actually a lot of studies that talk about the benefit of this, but no one was teaching it to me. So I was like, I remember being in another meeting a few months after I had started using humor, and I was like, man, this is incredibly boring. Someone should teach this person how to use humor. Like someone should teach them so that I'm not as bored in this meeting. And I was like, wait a second, I just went through the same thing. I could be that someone to teach them that thing. And that's when it began, not just using it for myself, but teaching other people how to do it as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think lots resonate actually with that story. So I live with ADHD, which I've mentioned here before. One way to look at ADHD is it's a condition of boredom. And it's actually an understimulation of the environment, of our work, of what we learn. We have this kind of weird thing where we kind of drug young kids to sit still in class, to pay attention to stuff which doesn't interest them. Then at the same time, in different contexts, we encourage them to get up and move around. So we kind of got this kind of weird sort of pathology in our culture that actually, maybe we just need to teach more fun things, or allow kids to play, or make work more purposeful. And I think that this is humor is just one of these kind of skill sets and levers or tools which allow us to do it. And so.
And certainly, and just quickly to that point, I mean, part of when we're talking to people about why to incorporate humor into the workplace, exactly kind of what you're talking about is, it's a very simple question, which you can answer, Ben, and also certainly those listening can answer in the comments as well. But the question is, would you rather do something that is fun or not fun? I don't know, Ben, what is your thought? Fun or not fun?
My instant reaction is fun.
Yeah, and
frankly, it's not making it complicated.
It's not a complicated question. It's kind of a dumb question, actually, because 99.9% of the people that we work with or that we speak to say fun. There's some people are like, wait, like how much is it going to cost? Or is it illegal, that fun thing or not? And no, it's a simple question, but it stands to reason then if you're then to make your work a little bit more fun, do you think you would enjoy it more? Or if you're going to make, learning a little bit more fun, do you think some students would be a little bit more engaged? And what's interesting is that in that context of what you're talking about, it's less of how do we change and make this more effective for other people? It's like, no, how do we force children to adapt to this kind of, rigorous methodology of how we're going to teach, as opposed to recognizing that when they play, that's actually when they learn a little bit more. And so I think part of it is, there's this old mentality of, well, it's always been this way. And that's what's interesting to me is some older generations are like, well, I hated my job and I still did okay. And I went through an entire career, and like, well, that doesn't mean that I have to. Like, progress to me isn't that you force me to go through the same things you went through. Progress is that you make it a better experience for the person that's next, isn't it?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think we maybe we overcomplicate and make things too hard as well. Wouldn't it be better also not just to make things fun, but actually make things easier and make them less complicated? And I think that we kind of just, I don't know. It's the kind of choices which we make without stopping to actually discuss, is this really the best way? But this is what Better Conversations is about, really, just to try and uncover and unpick some of these different ways of thinking about things and actually reconnecting with things which are there in our nature, but sometimes our kind of cultures squash them out. So we're conscious of time. Where is it best for leaders to, who are trying to get better at using humor, or perhaps B, who like humor outside of work and just don't bring it to the workplace? How do leaders go about starting to develop this and figure out where to go?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that for most people, the easiest place to start is kind of with yourself, is to recognize that if you are a little bit kind of hesitant, if you're not sure how it's going to land with other people, or if you're but I'm not terrible at telling stories, I'm not good at telling jokes, you start first with what kind of humor you use already well. And so we believe that humor is a skill, which means it can be learned, and that the question isn't, are you funny? The question is, what kind of funny are you? And if you start to understand that style, if you're someone who's like, I'm terrible in front of people, but I'm actually a really good cartoonist, or maybe you're like, I'm not funny myself, but I seem to always have these, movie quotes or these memes or these cartoons or whatever that I've seen from other people that I can apply in different situations. And great, start out in curation. Start out by kind of seeing like, oh, this funny thing. Oh, this is kind of exactly what we were talking about in that work meeting last week. So now I could send that out as an email to my team and say, hey, this funny thing kind of reminded me of what we were talking about yesterday. So start with whatever your personal strength is, and start kind of first with yourself. And then as you grow, as you improve, then you can start to be like, oh, okay, well, let me use it in this. Let me try it as a performance. Let me try it in this technique. Overall, though, what we train to get people started is when you're thinking about using humor, and it sounds like a little bit more effort at first, but it's a big focus, is we think about the medium, audience, and purpose. So medium is, how are you going to execute that humor? Is it in a video conference? Is it in an email? Is it direct and one-on-one conversation? Who is the audience? Is it just for yourself, or is it for other people? What does that audience need? What do they know, and what do they expect? So you can deliver against what they need in a way that they don't quite expect. And then finally, most importantly, what is the purpose? What do you want to achieve with that humor? Because humor just for the sake of humor, I think, is okay. But when you have a little bit more of clarity of why you want to do it, like, oh, I want to use some type of humor so that people pay attention at the beginning of this meeting. Well, that's different humor that you would use than if you're going to say, oh, I want to use some type of humor to relieve some stress after a difficult situation at work. So once you understand what we call your map, medium, audience, purpose, it gives you a little bit more clarity on what type of humor to use. But the biggest thing is to just start with yourself, start having a little bit of fun. You'll start to notice what works, and just make sure it stays positive and inclusive, because using humor at work, the goal is not to be that stand-up comedian. It's not to be like, oh, I need to toe that line and be really edgy. And that's what I see in aggressive and all that kind of stuff, because that's what I see in a comedy club. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about, again, being effective. So be positive and inclusive with the things that you try, and you'll start to develop, I think, your own style along the way.
Yeah, I like that. I think all hugely useful advice. And yeah, context matters. The pub is different to the workplace. So what might get a few laughs in the pub will probably not be appropriate in the workplace. Yep. And I think you mentioned about if you're being wheeled in to have a triple heart bypass, you don't want your surgeon telling you knock jokes. So so the kind of context and relationship matters as well. Can you say anything about the kind of relationship and trust and position? Anything there for leaders to consider?
Certainly. Well, and even the context of, like you mentioned, of like, yeah, if I'm having open heart surgery, I don't want my surgeon to be in a super playful mood where they're like, let's take out the aorta and like make a balloon animal out of it. However, I would probably want a surgeon who has good bedside manner, that maybe after the surgery was over had a little bit of positive humor, or in the waiting room had like, a stand-up comedy special playing, so I'm laughing and in a good mood before I go in. And so that's an important point, is that you don't have to use humor all the time. It's not like, oh, great, now everything has to be infused with humor. And humor doesn't replace the work. It's not like you can be like, someone asks you like, hey, where's that thing that I needed for this week? You can't make kind of a quick joke about it. And then they're like, no, seriously, we need that report for this meeting we're getting ready to go into. And be like, all right, well, see you later. Right? Like, you still have to actually do the work. And so I think from that perspective, having an understanding of the purpose helps with that intent. And I apologize, what was the specific question that you asked in that context? I got so excited about the surgery thing as an example.
Yeah, I think it was just talking about relationships and trust, because the relationship you have with that person will determine quite often how it lands. That's kind of my feeling. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. So humor is interesting, because a lot of times in a relationship with you where you have a lot of trust, there's probably going to be a lot more humor that comes out naturally. And at the same time, by using humor with someone that you don't know as well, you can build that trust. So it is both a way to achieve trust, and in some ways a symbol of how much trust there is. So starting with the first part first, yeah, when you get to know someone, there's certain types of humor that you can kind of use, again, being very positive, very inclusive, that like you get to know the other person, but as you get to know them a little bit more, you start to understand their sense of humor. And so you might adjust it. You might say that. And when we laugh, we create a positive shared experience together, and that brings people closer together. It's like kind of like, hey, we're on the same side because we're laughing about the same thing. Or if you specifically make me laugh or smile, then there's this component where it's like, oh, wow, you must really know me because you made me laugh. But on the flip side of that, it's also an interesting barometer of the trust that you have within a team. Like I said before, if you kind of look around and you're like, oh, people aren't really laughing or smiling that much with each other, or this person's always serious with me, then it might be an indication that that trust hasn't actually built up too far. So I think it's great for both.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Drew. I think huge amounts of insight, and I one or two more things to ask. But Sehaam's joined us, so she's been listening intently in the backstage, and I think you've got one or two questions, haven't you?
I do. I do have some questions. The thought that was going through my mind, Drew, is given how much time you spend in this space, and also the improv work that you do and so on, I was thinking your brain must go to some very interesting places. Do you find that sometimes, because you try out a lot of puns, and I like your puns, do you find that sometimes you make mistakes too? Like, you're an expert in it, but obviously you're having to experiment and try stuff out. So I don't know really where I'm going with this, but I guess I want to hear that you're human too and you make mistakes.
Absolutely. Well, and a couple of thoughts to that is one to say, in general, your humor just starts with a curiosity, exactly like you said, of kind of like your mind probably goes to interesting places. And I think a lot of people's does, but it just like what it goes to is what kind of partially builds that skill of humor for yourself is like, what do you find interesting? I like wordplay, like the juxtaposition of words and ideas. Like to me, that is interesting. Some people don't like that. They might go to stories, like they might hear something that immediately they think of a story. They might be visual in their head. And that's where it kind of goes back to the type of humor that you can use is build off your own personal strengths. But yeah, absolutely human about it. And, I remember recently pre-pandemic, I was speaking at an event in Singapore, and I love to travel and love going to different places. And I was like, I've never been to Malaysia. I had a weekend where I was still staying in Singapore. So I was like, maybe I can go to Malaysia. And I got booked for a English speaking stand-up show in Malaysia. While I was there, I was like, this would be great. It'd be fun. And I go and I just bomb. And in comedy, bombing is bad. To kill is good. Bombing is bad. It's a weird kind of language saying. But I bomb audience. And part of me was like, because I've certainly spoken in audiences before where they just haven't kind of outwardly expressed that they've enjoyed my material, but sometimes they've come up afterwards and kind of said that they have. So I was like, maybe this is just one of those audience, maybe just as a culture or whatever, they don't really laugh out loud all that much. Maybe it's just kind of like, maybe I did better than I thought. And then the person went up after me and crushed it. Like just absolutely made people like laugh hysterically. Judging based on the audience, you would have thought it was like the funniest comedy show ever. And I was like, oh no, it was clearly me. It was clearly me in this situation. And it was because I hadn't done my like research on the audience. I had like, I assumed I was like, it's an international audience for me. So the work that I've done in Europe, when I've done shows in like Germany and the UK and all that kind of stuff, I'll just bring that same material and it'll work great. And I was like, no, I hadn't adapted the material to the audience. So I learned from that lesson. So absolutely there are things that I try. And it happens all of the time. Like, people often have that question of like, what do you do if someone doesn't laugh at your joke? And what's interesting is that if you make a positive, inclusive joke and no one laughs, it just becomes a positive, inclusive statement. And so it's usually only awkward if you let it be awkward, if you dwell on it, if you like say a joke and then you're like, right? Come on, right? Is this thing on, etc. Right? Like if you do all that, then people are like, wait, this is weird. Versus if you like kind of say it and you maybe wait just a beat and then move on from it, just people are like, okay, this is enjoyable. Right. So that's how I try to deal with, when it's not working for me.
Right. Right, just let it land and move on, right? Keep going. But also, if you say something and once it falls out your mouth and you kind of go, maybe that wasn't quite appropriate, you can apologize, right? What would you recommend? What if you say something and it just, it creates an awkwardness that you didn't intend, rather than it just not being caught?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you can apologize. What's really interesting about comedy, and humor is more broad than comedy. So when we're talking about humor in the workplace, we're not talking about specifically just punchlines. But when it comes to kind of comedy, which is something that you can learn and improve at as well, comedy is actually really simple. The question is, to a comedian at least, if you ask someone like, is this funny? The answer really is, well, did it make someone laugh? That's pretty simple. Doesn't mean that it's easy. It's a pretty simple definition of whether something is funny or not. The same thing applies, though, as to whether something is offensive, right? So you can say, is this thing offensive? Well, it's like, did it offend someone? And even if it's like one person, then technically it can be a little bit offensive. And so for a comedian, for a comedy club stage, maybe they're like, well, that's part of my goal and I need to find the line, et cetera, again, but that's not what we're talking about at work. So if you did offend someone, even if you don't feel like it should have been offensive, then absolutely you can apologize and try to better understand why it was offensive. So for example, my material is rated mom. Like I always want my mom comfortable and happy with whatever I said. So I don't go blue. That's when you kind of like curse or talk about sexual topics or other things as well. Like it's pretty clean comedy. But probably about a year and a half ago, I posted to Twitter and Facebook, which is where I get a lot of my humor out. A joke that I thought was very benign, was very open, but some people were offended by it. And the joke was around dyslexia. And I said, has dyslexia ever ruined a wedding? Has a bride or groom ever been at the altar and when they get to the vows, say, instead of saying I do, they said, do I? And so I think it's just kind of this play on words a little bit. But a few people let me know in the comments, they're like, hey, I'm dyslexic. And there's always this stereotype. And they're like, first of all, that would never happen because dyslexia is mostly a kind of a written thing and it's around spelling more often. 2, it's with individual letters, not with words. And 3, like we get these types of stereotypical jokes all the time. We just I talked with a friend directly about it. And she's like, I just kind of expected better from you. Right. I come to your feed because it's very open and because it's very positive. And this was just feel like it was, starting my morning with an attack. Now, I didn't think it wasn't anything aggressive. It's not like I'm saying mentally and think that people with dyslexia are stupid or whatever. But it helped me to recognize oh, okay, this was offensive in this way. And I still left the joke up because it became a learning point for me. Because people were like, actually, we're seeing dyslexia not as a learning disability, but as a different way of thinking. In fact, here are all the benefits to people who have dyslexia, the way that they are so much more creative in some respects than people who don't. And so we're seeing it as a different way of thinking, not as a wrong way of thinking or something that's wrong with the brain. And so I think that's the approach where you can, is to say, okay, let me, understand why it was offensive. Let me apologize for the fact that it was. And then can I use that as a learning opportunity? Can I then share that with more people to be like, oh, did you know this? My brother's dyslexic. I had no idea these were kind of the benefits or the ways that he was thinking about stuff. So it gave me a little bit more context. And now I can be a little bit more broader, a little bit smarter about how I have a conversation about it.
Right. That I find that interesting because I think there is a tender point here, which is that to that very joke. I mean, the sentiment for me is visual when you shared that, and I can see the humor in it, which is why I laughed. So, but I certainly didn't intend any offense, and I can laugh at stuff that may be in certain contexts very inappropriate, but in private I will laugh at with people I trust. Now, this is a really difficult line to manage, because in public you have to say one thing and toe the line in a certain way, but in private you may behave differently. How do we navigate that? Because that's really tricky.
It is, and I think it's partially a symbol of that, how much trust you have in this situation, and that's what's interesting. So we, a lot of times when you talk about humor, you spend so much time, at least people who speak about humor spend so much time on the benefits, of which there are many, but there are, of course, dangers. And in fact, recently we did a an entire video on the dangers of laughter, of like the fact that, yeah, laughter might imply complicity, or the fact that if you laugh at a certain joke, and if it's maybe offensive to a certain group, does that mean you believe in kind of the exact joke, or you are like following that exact thing? So if you laugh at a joke that is racist, does that make you a racist? And I don't think so, right? But it does, like, there might be additional context or things that need to happen with that. So I think you're exactly right. Like, what we laugh at also does give a little bit of insight into our character and how we react to humor. So as leaders, one, we have to be aware of that, because with status differentials, you might say something that actually kind of makes people cringeworthy, but they will laugh because it's awkward. So a laughter doesn't imply agreement, doesn't imply that, hey, I believe fully everything that you just said, because it could just be out of like joke construction. Like Anthony Jeselnik is a comedian who is very aggressive. I don't necessarily agree with a lot of things that he's saying, but he's very good at joke writing. And so there might be something that almost like makes me laugh, and then like, oh, I don't actually know if I want to laugh at that, but the construction of it was very good. Or again, it might be the awkwardness of like, everyone else seems to be laughing, so maybe I'll kind of laugh along just because it would be weirder if I didn't. And so recognize laughter is not kind of this sign off to say I believe in that thing. And I think the broader perspective of it is exactly right. And that's not what I'm saying is part of, right, when we talk about bringing your authentic self to work, we're not saying, well, at home, I usually sit around in sweatpants and I curse a lot, and, I drink a lot. So I guess if I'm going to be my authentic self at work, that means I'm going to wear sweatpants to work, and I'm going to curse a lot, and I'm going to drink all the time at work. Like, no, we're talking about bring your appropriate professional authentic self to work. And that's the same thing with humor. The type of humor that you use with your friends is probably going to be very different than the type of humor that you use with a group of coworkers. And that is completely okay. And it's probably for the best. And so recognize, okay, what is the right situation in this situation? And when I think about humor, the word that comes to mind the most, more so than funny, more so than even fun, is effective. Right? I'm using humor in the workplace because it can be effective. It can help me do these things. And so it goes back to that broader question of the type of humor that you're going to use, or what you laugh in certain situation. Is it going to be effective towards what you want to try to achieve long term? And then also, is it going to be fun? And is it going to be funny as kind of follow-ups from that, as opposed to a comedian thinking the most important thing is that it is funny. So yes, absolutely. It will change. And you'll evolve that over time. That's part of the trust piece that we're talking about, is as you get to know a group a little bit more, the type of humor that you use will change, because you'll know what works and doesn't work with that group.
Mm-hmm. No, for sure. I'm planning, just to let you know, I'm going to run a little bit over just because I want to get as much Drew time here. Ben, did you have any questions?
Yeah, and I think it maybe followed on a little bit with these kind of tensions, and also connects with the dyslexia point as well, that part of our brain really likes explicit, literal interpretations, whether it's kind of language or instructions, and another part of our brain, perhaps the kind of more brain associated with the dyslexic, is slightly more kind of creative, understands and appreciates the implicit meaning, irony, the kind of all of the kind of the kind of meanings which aren't necessarily obvious unless you kind of understand. And so it's that kind of tension really that trying to find inclusive comedy, it's a bit like language as well and conversation, that tension between trying to not make something so literal, or you have to spell it out, and that's never great with a joke, and trying to point out what it means. Yeah, how do we toe this line between not making something so requires so much interpretation, but then again also not making something so explicit as well? And I was just trying to get some thoughts really around that.
Yeah, it is. It's an interesting question, because and to get into a very tactical piece of things, much of comedy specifically. So again, I just want to stress that when we're talking about humor in the workplace, we are talking about more broad than comedy, where the definition that we use for humor is that it's a comic, absurd, or incongruous quality causing amusement. And that amusement piece is kind of the key to it. So it's less about making the workplace funny and more about making it a little bit more fun. Now, obviously, within humor, if there's comedy, absurdity, and incongruity is a great thing. Just doing something a little bit different, just by having a little bit of a different phrase, or just by sheer fact of like my self-proclaimed job title is humor engineer. That's a little bit incongruous because people read it and they're like, wait, I've never heard of that. What is a humor engineer? What does that mean? Like, it's just to get them to think in, to lean in a little bit more. And I'm a humor engineer because I was a computer science engineer before at P&G, and I was solving problems using computer science, right? Project management, programming, etc. And then I started solving workplace challenges with humor. So I was like, okay, I think that makes me a humor engineer. So that's where it comes from. But that incongruity can be humorous. It's not necessarily me laugh out loud funny, but it's something a little bit different. It's a sense of play. But if we want to drill deeper into this idea of comedy, then kind of the fundamental structure of comedy in a lot of ways is setup and punchline. So setup creates an expectation in the listener's mind, and then the punchline breaks that expectation. Or you might say that setup creates a question. Where are they going with this? Why are they saying this? What does this mean? And then answers that question in an unexpected way. And Jerry Seinfeld talked about kind of a setup and punchline as two edges of a metaphorical cliff. And he was like, okay, so if you have two edges of a cliff, if the edges are too close to each other and there's not really much of a gap, then no one's going to laugh because it's not very exciting, right, to walk across that gap. If the edges are too far apart, then people won't be able to get the joke and they'll fall down in the middle and the comedy will die as well. So it's got to be kind of that perfect edge, which is basically there's got to be enough work. That's part of about humor is like people want like a little bit of that work. So for example, a pun is a great kind of clear distillation of setup and punchline, or this idea of a gap. So I can say something like, a man once asked me if I wanted some free fish. So I asked, what's the catch? And so there's this little bit of this gap where you have to say, okay, this is clearly a setup and punchline. It's delivered as such that what's the catch is a punchline. Why is that funny? What is that? Okay, what's the catch is like, okay, what's the catch in terms of this getting something for free? And oh, what's the catch of this fish? Like now, okay, now I start to understand this. And so you have to have a little bit of that gap. And how far that gap should be, again, that's going to be different on different people. It's also going to be different for different cultural audience as well. And so a big part of it goes back to that audience piece and that the fact that you're going to have to adapt. Now, the question becomes, okay, well, how do you know it works? How do you know if this humor is going to land or not? The key, just like any skill, and certainly you can read books on it, you can take workshops on it, but it ultimately comes down to practice. And this is why comedians put in a lot of practice. Like if you see a stand-up special on Netflix, it's been hours of people working on that. It's not like they just walked out on stage that night and were like, hey, someone filmed me talking for an hour. And you're like, oh, that happened to be great. It's like, no, they workshop that in comedy clubs. They probably talk to their comedy friends to say, hey, this certain bit isn't working for me. How can I adjust it? Or they do a little bit of humor and realize that they can then tag it or whatever. And so you want to practice it. And what we try to do, and what I think is important to do, is to try to find safe spaces that you can practice it in. And that's what an open mic is for a comedian, is to say, okay, I'm going to try this and I don't know if it's going to work yet, but let me try it, see if it does. And if it doesn't, okay, now the next time I try it, I can adjust. And that's similar to improv. If you want to get better at improv, find a safe space to practice improv in an improv workshop, or bring it into your organization. But what I learned from improv and what I learned from stand-up in this way, which I think is a valuable lesson outside of the use of humor, is that in many contexts, failure is just data, right? So if I say a joke and people don't laugh, it's not commentary on my worth as a person. It's not saying I'm not a funny person. It's saying the way that I just tried it in that moment did not work. And failure is just data. So now I can iterate it on in the future and say, okay, that didn't work. So if I try it next time, if I tweak it this way, maybe I need to pause a little bit longer, or maybe I need a different word choice, or maybe it's a different kind of angle on this particular joke. Now I can improve it. And that, I think, applies to any type of thing that you're learning, is failure is just data.
Right. And the, I think what you were saying there, I was thinking about anyone who's got a presentation, a professional presentation that they're wanting to make. These are all really important tips that you're providing, because it does require practice. You do have to think about your delivery. If you do want to create a sort of a lightness or a way of getting the audience to kind of connect or relax in preparation for any information you're about to share, those all require, you have to engineer those. You have to give them thought. You can't, unless you are amazingly good at just making it up on the spot, and you know your way well. I have a question, which is
and very, very quickly to that, read it before you get to that question, is that's what we talk about, like, what kind of funny are you? And so my brother is a professor at Texas A&M, and he is what we would consider more of a performer, and that he will make people laugh. He will make his students laugh. And like, I'll go and observe him, like, that was amazing. You made them laugh in all these different spots. And he's like, oh, did I? Like, it's not like his thing is planned out, but that's his skill set, versus my skill set is I'm going to like plan this out, and it's going to be structured, and it's going to be set on punchline. In fact, we were speaking together at an event in Morocco. And because my brother now teaches a course on the rhetoric of humor, and that same kind of idea, like he's like, because he teaches this course on communication, and I went down and I would guest lecture once a semester, and he would look at his valuations at the end of the semester, and they would almost all reference the one class that I taught. It would be like, oh, your and Drew's class was so funny, or Drew's class was amazing, or I had so much fun when we did improv, or I had so much fun when we talked about humor. And he'd be like, I was here for an entire semester. You were here for 1 hour with them, and you are what they remember. And so he was like, it can't be you. It's got to be the humor thing. So he started researching all the benefits of using humor in education, started teaching a course on rhetoric of humor. We were presenting together at this event in Morocco pre-pandemic. And afterwards, we're in the elevator ride down. And this woman was like, I find it so interesting that you two are brothers because you're so different. And first of all, we look very different. I get told I look kind of like skinny Hugh Jackman, which I'll take. Always the skinny side, though. It's always emphasized. I'm never Wolverine Hugh Jackman. I'm always like frail Hugh Jackman. And then my brother looks kind of like hipster Jesus, like glasses and all that kind of stuff. So we look very different. He's also much taller than me. But she's like, what's interesting, though, is you're so different. She's like, she turned to my brother and she's like, your humor is so conversational. It's so warm. And then she turned to me and she's like, and yours is more cold. And I think what she meant by it was that my brother is that conversational humor, that performer type, that just the way that he says things is funny, where mine is I have clear 7 punchlines. And so those are just different styles. And to your point, you want to understand what that style is. And in fact, we have an assessment on our website to kind of take a quick assessment of that, to kind of say, okay, what is your natural style? And then what are some of those natural strengths and weaknesses to that style, that persona, so that you can start to leverage that in the workplace. So sorry, I just wanted to kind of give that perspective of, yeah, if you're good at the performance, and maybe you don't need to do quite as much on that side, but you might need to think a little bit more proactively about how you want to use it intentionally.
I just put up the link. Is that where someone can go and have a look and figure out what their humor style is?
Absolutely. If you go to humor.me/start, we've got a bunch of free resources there. And the very first top one is to take the assessment.
Okay, cool. I might do that. One final question from me. And I remember you mentioning this last time we spoke about a year ago, was so if I deliver some kind of humorous statement to my team as a woman, I may not get as many laughs as a male colleague delivering the exact same line in the exact same situation. Can you explain that?
Certainly. Well, so there's a couple of things I think at play. And the biggest, the broadest context is that the source of humor has an impact on whether or not something is perceived as funny. And this is something that Seinfeld explored years ago on the TV show, where he made the joke of, he's like, I think this fellow comedian of mine became Jewish just so he could say these Jewish jokes, right? So there's certainly like same thing of like what a black comedian says is going to be very different than what an Asian comedian can say, and whether or not we find certain things funny or not. So the source of humor actually absolutely has an impact on that humor. And so in one study done at Wharton, they did find that when men used humor in the workplace, they were met more with a positive response. When women used it, they were not. They were seen as kind of like more aggressive. Now, in that particular study, to that point, they used the exact same humor, but that type of humor is going to have an impact. One of the jokes that they talked about was the presenter saying, oh, something along the lines of, I shared a run through of this presentation with my spouse. And their response was like, well, if it's as boring as you just delivered it, no one is going to like it. Something relatively aggressive like that. Now, if just based on kind of dynamics of gender, of how people perceive different genders right now, yeah, if a man says that, then people are probably going to laugh a little bit of like, oh, look at that funny kind of power structure based on kind of these stereotypes that we have. However, if a woman says that, that feels like, wait, are you in an abusive relationship? That feels like, right, it feels different, very different. So the source of humor has an impact. In a different study, they found that when men used humor in the workplace, they were met with a positive response around 90% of the time. So positive response being a laugh or a smile. And when women used humor in the workplace, they were met with a positive response only 20% of the time. Obviously a huge gap. In that same study, they took a look at what was the type of humor that was used. And for the men, 80% of the humor that they used was off the cuff. It was kind of conversational humor brought up in the moment. 70% of the humor that women used was self-deprecating humor. And self-deprecating humor can be a great form of humor. So that's a form of humor where you're talking about and poking fun of yourself. So for example, I'll sometimes say things like, I listen to podcasts at 2x speed because not only is it faster, but then also more people sound like me. Right. So it's me poking fun at my voice a little bit. Or I'll say, I'm a frail person. I was born 3.7 kilograms and then stayed that way till I was 15 years old. Right? So it's kind of like this self-deprecating humor that focuses on me. So self-deprecating humor is great in two contexts. One, it's great when you are using it sparingly. Because if you only ever, unless you're Rodney Dangerfield, if you're always using self-deprecating humor, then people start to worry about you. They're like, wait, is this a self-esteem issue? Is this a pity party? Like, is it okay for me to even laugh? Because all they ever do is put themselves down. And then the second context is that self-deprecating humor is great when you're in a high status position. As a leader or if you're presenting on a stage, it's to say, hey, I don't take myself too seriously. I'm also a human. We can kind of connect on this, etc. So because of gender bias in the workplace, because of other things that we have to work on, if for whatever reason your status is already perceived to be a little bit lower, then to use self-deprecating humor is only going to lower that status more, and people are less likely to laugh and more think like, well, I guess that's true, or again, the pity party thing. And so all that to say is absolutely, as by gender, by race, by ethnicity, there's different kind of things to take into mind when it comes to using humor. I say this I recognize from a very privileged position in the sense that I am a straight white male that lives in the United States. Like, I have a lot of privileges, so I don't know all the ins and outs. But what I have learned from talking with other comedians and other people is that it doesn't mean that you can't use humor. It does mean that you probably have to be a little bit more conscious about how you do it and change maybe the different styles. And so that is something that you do have to kind of keep in the back of your mind. But it doesn't mean that you can't use humor at all. It just means we have to be a little bit more conscious about the how.
That's interesting. And Mag made a comment, can perhaps self-deprecating is more allowable than calling out other stereotypes? Is it a kind of respectful comedy?
And it is. It is something where you can kind of, again, you target yourself and you say, hey, like, and this you'll notice this with comedians a lot, is they start with themselves, and by targeting themselves, you kind of say, hey, this is me just being playful. And it allows me to open up a little bit about other conversations, because it's not, them aggressive about that person. It's just finding the humor in situations. And I think in general for the workplace, yes, we want respectful comedy. As again, a goal is not to become a stand-up comedian. It is to use humor to be more effective. And if you are offending people with your humor, you're probably not being effective. And so you may want to adapt that style.
Wow. Well, I feel like the time, we could keep on talking. I'm going to hand back. I didn't mean to take over there, Ben, either, but over to you.
No, I think that there's just so much there, and thanks for coming on, and obviously getting out of bed as well this morning. So
we're grateful.
So I'm sure Sehaam and I could have dragged out a conversation on humour and whatnot, but it was so nice to have you on here, and I think we covered off quite a lot of subjects. But yeah, what you touched on at the end, I think, being conscious, being conscious about how we have conversations, how we use humor, how we do everything, and we're kind of a little bit on autopilot. And going back to our earlier conversation, we're almost like programmed with facts and ways of doing things in school. And we kind of not realizing that the world and people around us have changed quite significantly. So, how, where, why, when we kind of use things like kind of better conversations and humor is incredibly important, rather than this all or nothing mindset almost that we have, that actually, well, this is my skill now, I'm just going to use it 100% of the time in all the contexts. And so being conscious and being nuanced and being flexible, I think is kind of, for me, quite a few key takeaways, apart from humor just being great for all of us.
Yeah. Well, and I think a big part of that is actually what this message is over my shoulder is I am a big believer that you are responsible for your own happiness. And I don't think that you can control it. And it's not kind of about that, but I think you are responsible for it. Like, I don't think that it is up to your manager to make sure that you're having fun at work. I don't think it's up to your spouse to make sure that they are, relieving stress for you. I don't think it's up to your family members to make sure that everything is fun. I think hopefully they don't, make it worse, and hopefully they do contribute to part of that. That's kind of the community aspect of it. But I think ultimately for you individually, you are responsible for your own happiness. And so finding ways to make things a little bit more fun. And that's the mindset that I learned from improvisation, right? If we say, yes, I'm going to work 10,000 hours, right? We can say yes and say, and I might as well enjoy it. And let me find ways to make this a little bit more fun. It doesn't mean that you're immediately going to love every single thing that you do. It doesn't immediately mean that any terrible thing, that awful that you like is going on that comes up, that you're going to absolutely love it. But it's going to give you a different perspective. And when we can find, so there's just to kind of close, there's a equation that we often talk about in comedy, where comedy equals tragedy plus time, which is where, like, okay, if something tragic happens, after enough time has elapsed, we can kind of see the comedy in it, right? So that's where, like, those embarrassing stories from school, we can kind of like laugh about now because it's been enough time. But when they first happened, they're like, this is the worst thing ever in the world. What's interesting, though, what we've started to find is that if something tragic happens, if you can find the comedy in it, it will make it feel like more time has passed. And I think this has been something that has been true for us in the pandemic as we've been working with people, is by laughing at something or finding the humor in it in the face of adversity, and we can kind of laugh at the face of adversity, we can say, you don't control me, right? I can't control this situation. I'm not saying that this situation is for the best or that it's like that I love that it happened. But if I can find the humor in it, then I can say, okay, at least I'm still responsible for my own happiness. At least I can find a way I can have a little bit of ownership of this in terms of my reaction to it. And I'm laughing at it, so it helps to relieve a little bit of the stress and the tension that caused. And I think that's part of the value of learning humor. So when we talk about it, absolutely, we want to train it because it helps you improve your communication skills, helps you relieve stress, but it also gives you this autonomy. It gives you this sense of ownership. And it can also give you a little bit more confidence. That's what it did for me. So those are the like kind of very personal benefits to learning this skill.
No, it's brilliant. I was going to mention about the pandemic, and I think that what you've just said is one of the kind of divides which maybe some businesses will face. Some will double down on control and seriousness, and basically kind of squashing any sort of play and freedom, and maybe the more creative organizations will embrace things like humor and play and flexibility more. And so it's good to hear that actually even during the pandemic we can have a laugh at something very unfunny. But I think that's important. Before we go, Drew, I don't know if it's been mentioned to you about the phrase of the week. We do this thing, phrase of the week, every Tuesday, and so we get our guests just to basically, we go off screen, we get you on screen, and you have a speech bubble around you, and so tell us your phrase of the week, but also give us a quick prompt as to what it's about and why it matters, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
So, I'll just set that up, Drew. Yeah. So we're going to disappear. We're going to scarper and leave you. No, we're not. We'll come back. And let me just set that up for you.
Yeah, and I think, and if it's okay, so for me, I think we'll do a phrase of the week, and then we'll do a joke of the week. So the first phrase of the week is, I do believe that you are responsible for your own happiness. And what that means is that you don't control it, but you can do things to try to make things a little bit more fun. And that's what we mean by using humor in the workplace. One thing that I love to do to make things a little bit more fun is to tell puns. And so we can add to that maybe a joke of the week. And let's see, for the joke of the week, this is an old one that I wrote a long time ago, but I recently rediscovered it. And that is, I think that I'm going to buy stock in Altoids and always keep Altoids in my suit because that makes them a good investment. Get to invest, the mint, right? A stock, an Altoid that's in your suit is an investment. Never mind. That I think is the humor, but ultimately you are responsible for your own happiness. So if you can find ways to make things a little bit more fun, we'll add a slight bonus phrase as a way to do that. It's to drive 1 smile per hour. Try to think about what's one thing that you can do each hour of the day to bring a smile to your face or to the face of someone else around you. And that's going to help you to develop your humor habit. And from there, you'll start to find the benefits of using humor in the workplace.
Brilliant,
Love it.
Drew. Yeah, love it. Love it. Awesome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, a lovely chat, lots of other things. And we'll put links to your website and all of those details in the description. We'll be sharing those as well. And yeah, that kind of brings us to the end of today. Next Tuesday, it's going to be a mashup, right, Ben? It's going to be you, Glenn, and Hazbi. It's that intersection of what?
Talent, neurodiversity, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think we just want to explore, different thinking, people, and inclusive cultures. So I think that. We haven't really planned anything, but there'll be plenty of interesting conversations.
It's going to be improvised.
It's improvised. It's improvised. So I think that that we haven't.
Well,
we haven't planned yet.
And I'll just add a quick point to that. First of all, thank you so much for having me on. I apologize, certainly that I slept there. You can tell I'm not a morning person. I don't hate mornings. I just don't want to be awake for them. So that was the problem here. In fact, it's weird to me because we call it mourning, just like we mourn the loss of someone. It's mourning the loss of sleep. That's why we call it mourning, I think. But that interesting point of the improvisation, here's a great point, and this is why you should tune in next week. Because even if they come together, improvisation does not mean completely winging it. It does not making up something like that they've never said before. Improvisation is about taking full kind of ownership and control over the situation with your expertise, bringing your expertise and your experience to the present moment and adapting to the situation. And so that's why I have no doubt that next week, even if you didn't plan something so far, a conversation between Ben, Glenn, and whoever else is showing up on this channel is going to be fantastic that you definitely want to join and see.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Drew. Yes,
thank
definitely.
you. Thank you, Drew. Very kind words. And I'm definitely not going to plan now. But no, you're right. There is this balance, isn't there? We can over prepare and over plan for almost everything to the minute detail.
Yeah.
But actually, sometimes you just need to have an idea about what you want to explore, and then just prepare and adapt for it.
Well, I'm taking a leaf out of Drew's book and Glenn's book because just wing it. Just he's commented on there, 0 plan so far. Yeah, exactly. So, but it's part of the what comes, right? It's riffing off each other, and I think, given what we're trying to do here, that's the whole point: is to allow, there are things that each is passionate about, and so. The worlds collide, so let's explore that. That's what we're going to be doing next week, and and I'm glad you made it out of bed too. That was awesome.
Yeah, it was great show.
We're not going to live that one down, Drew. We will remind you. That's okay. Nicely.
Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Drew. We are going to, we will see you, we'll see you next Tuesday, folks. And we're going to wrap up and leave you with a reminder about Leaders Who Coach, if you're interested. But yeah, do tune in, follow, and let us know who you would like, what you would like us to talk about in future shows. We are definitely open for exploring that. So if you've got a strong opinion, let us know. We're here to listen and to ask you a ton of questions. So thank you.
Cool. Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye. Do you feel invisible at work, talked over? Would you give more if your boss listened to you more? Would leading the team be more rewarding if your direct reports actually did what you asked? How about those important strategic decisions? Do you wish your peers would involve you much sooner? Leaders who coach feel calmer, more confident, and definitely more influential. And you can start feeling that way too in just 4 months. I'm Sehaam Cyrene. I'm an executive coach, and I teach leaders how to show up stronger with integrity and with an inclusive and empowering mindset. Leaders Who Coach is a CPD certified online course that I've designed and delivered to C-suite leaders, VPs, directors, senior managers, and founders. You'll learn to hold important conversations, surfacing what's really going on while helping your people grow. You'll learn to express your different opinion in ways that keep others listening. And you'll learn to motivate your direct reports with less effort and more accountability. It's time to design your style of leadership. Enroll now at leaderswhocoach.today.